Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the January webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. These monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website at www.iea-coal.org. Residents in our member countries and employees of sponsoring organisations can download reports for free after a one-off registration. You can find more details on our website. The presentation today is on the supply chain costs of biomass co-firing and in particular wood pellets used in pulverised fuel existing coal power stations. Now, as we're all well aware, we need to reduce emissions in the energy sector if we're going to meet the targets agreed upon as part of the Paris Agreement. Currently, around 40% of the world's electricity is produced using coal, and if we move away to more renewable technologies, then we will end up with a number of stranded assets. One way of utilising these assets is to introduce biomass and to co-fire with coal. So the presentation itself, we'll look at some of the costs associated with co-firing, some of the biomass fuels available for co-firing. There's a focus on the wood pellet market. We'll also review the greenhouse gas emissions associated with co-firing. And then we'll use two useful tools, the levelised cost of electricity generation and the cost of CO2 abatement to determine the competitiveness of co-firing relative to other renewable technologies. So, for co-firing to play a long-term role in any future emissions reduction scenarios, it must meet two major requirements. Firstly, co-firing must be affordable so it can compete with other renewable technologies. And secondly, it must be sustainable. Now, this isn't related just to the sustainability of supply. There's actually more in-depth sustainability required when utilising biomass. Now, at the current time, there is no industry-wide overarching biomass sustainability criteria. There are a number of countries, namely the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium and Denmark, that have their own, albeit slightly different, sustainability criteria. There's some that are starting to be developed in Asia as use of biomass is starting to grow. But generally, sustainability criteria can be classified into three main categories. The first is the environmental criteria. So this relates to greenhouse gas savings, preservation of the environment and of the carbon stock. The second category is socio-economic issues. So this deals with security of food supply, workers and property rights. And then finally, cross-cutting issues, so direct and indirect land use change, biodiversity and socio-economic outcomes. Now, there is already an existing IEA report, IEA Clean Coal Centre report on this called The Sustainability of Biomass Co-Firing. That's available on our website if anybody's interested in learning more about this issue. But if we start to look at the first requirement, affordability, and review some of the costs that are associated with co-firing, they can be split into two main categories. Firstly, the cost of the fuel itself, the biomass fuel. In general, it's more expensive than the fossil fuel it replaces. And then the second cost category is to do with upgrading or modifying existing infrastructure. Now, this again can be split into two. So there's transport infrastructure such as ports and rails that need modification. Typically, the costs associated with this is covered by the operators themselves. There has been recent investment in port facilities, particularly in North America and in the EU. These run into the tens of millions, but again, this isn't a capital cost that can be attributed to the power station end user. The capital costs that the power station will face are related to any infrastructure modifications that need to be made at the plant itself. These are typically dependent on co-firing ratios and what what kind of state the actual plant is in itself. So it's all scenario specific. So if we start to look at the first cost that's attributed to co-firing, the fuel itself, it's dependent on a number of things. The first being what type of biomass you're going to use. There are a few different forms and types of biomass available. Woody biomass in the form of wood chips and pellets derived from species like pine. That's the most widely utilised today. Herbaceous plants and agricultural residues, these are available for co-firing. They are cheaper than wood pellets, but there are some issues regarding the ash behaviour. Typically, these are only used in low co-firing ratios. There is some experience at higher co-firing ratios, but more capital investment is required in modification of the existing plant. Then finally, another option for another type of biomass available for co-firing are pre-treated fuels. Now this relates mainly to torrefied pellets and steam exploded pellets. These are starting now to be produced in reasonably high quantities, but nothing at the extent that would be required for a power station. Also, there is no evidence of any current commercial contracts between suppliers and consumers. So this is discussed more in the actual report, but for the webinar, we're going to focus on wood pellets. So wood pellets themselves, as I said, they're the most widely deployed in both heat and the electricity generation sectors. The pellets themselves are made from roundwood, forest residues. So these are the residues left after a forest has been harvested, typically branches and treetops. Wood chips, again, can be the result of forest harvesting. Wood processing residues, so these are a forest has been harvested, the wood has been taken to a processing factory. They process the wood and generate sawdust and shavings. These can be used to produce wood pellets. And then storm salvage trees and diseased trees can all be used for wood pellets. Now, because there's such a wide range of feedstocks available, there is now an international standard to regulate the pellet quality. This is based on things like moisture content, there's some ash characteristics in there, pellet size, pellet durability. There is also actually ISOs for pre-treated and agricultural residue fuels and herbaceous fuels. These can be found under the same international standard, if anybody's interested in those standards themselves. Now, wood pellets have got a bit of a bad reputation recently because it's particularly in the UK, where there's been a few articles in the press suggesting that wood pellets have been produced from virgin forests, where actually this graph taken from DRAX highlights actually what feedstocks are used in pellet production. So in 2016, DRAX used about 6.5 million tonnes of wood pellets, and 40% of the feedstock for those pellets came from sawmill residues. Now, there's a reason for this. They are the favoured feedstock for pellets because they require the least steps to produce a pellet. If you think of a roundwood, it needs to be debarked, chipped, hand milled before it can be dried and pelletized, whereas sawmill residues, sawdust especially, can typically just be dried before pelletization. Also, this graph highlights that around 19% of DRAX's feedstock for their pellets came from roundwood, but in particular low-grade roundwood. So this is roundwood that's not typically able to be used in making products because it's not of the right quality. So this kind of debunks the myth a little bit that wood pellets are produced from virgin forests. Now, another reason for the wide range of feedstocks is the actual competition for the feedstock itself. This is just a snapshot of pellet production in the southeast USA. The pellet plants are in red, The sawmill locations are in grey, and the pulp mills are in orange. Now, if you think a pellet plant typically will produce anywhere from 100,000 to 700,000 tonnes a year of wood pellets, gives you some idea of the kind of feedstock amounts required. So not only have we got competition from other pellet producers for the feedstock available at the sawmills or the local forests, we've also got competition from pulp mills. So this is why such a wide range of feedstocks is available for wood pellet production. This slide is a snapshot of wood pellet trade flows in 2015. Now, I should say this includes both pellets used for heating and pellets used in the electricity generation sector. Actually, there's a slightly different international standard for the heating pellets. The only difference is essentially that when you're producing a heating pellet, you can include the bark. Now, the bark has a higher ash content than the actual wood itself. So if you included the bark into a wood pellet, then you're outside of the specifications for the international standard. But even so, it's a competing market. It's the pellets are produced from the same feedstocks. So in 2015, global demand for both heat and electricity was at around 26 million tonnes, and this had increased from around 6 million tonnes in 2006. So it's quite a rapid increase in global pellet demand. And the largest consumer of those pellets was the EU, consuming around 20 million tonnes a year. Now, of those 20 million tonnes demand, they were able to produce 14 million tonnes themselves, but this was predominantly for the heating market. The cleaner pellets required for electricity generation, they all were sourced from, the majority, sorry, were sourced from North America. And as you can see on the plot, the North America to EU is the dominant trade route. This was the focus of the report, actually, because it's the dominant trade route. So anything that we look at later on will consider the North America to EU electricity market trade routes. There are producers in other parts of the world. Russia do produce wood pellets. Asia do produce wood pellets. Also, the US does ship a small quantity to Asia. But actually, Asia, the market is expected to grow significantly. It's been suggested that China alone could demand up to 30 million tonnes a year by 2020, and then Japan and South Korea additionally could increase their demand up to around 14 million tonnes for wood pellets. So if those figures are seen by maybe 7 years' time, then there could be a significant increase in global pellet demand. Now, how this affects the market is uncertain. It's expected that Asia, particularly China, will try and meet their own demand. Growth in Europe is expected. Since this figure was published, there was an additional unit at DRAX that's come online. Just this week, actually, DRAX announced that Unit 4 will be converted to 100% biomass. So this global demand is expected to continue to increase, mainly driven by increases in demand in Asia. Europe will see some increases in demand, but not to the extent that we're expecting to see in Asia. Now, because wood pellets are so widely used now, they've become a globally traded commodity. They have an associated free on board and cost insurance and freight price. Now, the free on board price is the cost of a wood pellet that's been produced, transported to the local export port, and then loaded onto the ship. It does not include the transportation, the freight rates itself. So this was just a snapshot taken in October 2017 of global free on board prices. America is $136, Canada slightly cheaper, Europe is around about $140 per tonne, Vietnam, theirs is significantly cheaper at $112 a tonne, but they don't produce in the quantities that would be needed in an EU power station. Now, just for comparison, coal prices highlighted there at the time of $91 per tonne. But I should highlight again, this is on a mass basis and not an energy basis. What drives the free on board price is, as I said, the cost of the pellet itself, so the production of the pellet and the local transportation costs to port. A large percentage of this free on board cost is actually the feedstock material itself, and the Energy Information Administration in the US now require that any pellet producers producing more than 10,000 tonnes in the US have to, by law, report both the cost and type of the feedstock used. So here, feedstock costs are around about $25 to $46 a tonne, and when you think back to the free on board price, that's around 25 to 30% of the overall cost. Interestingly, the sawmill residue, the preferred pellet feedstock, is the most expensive, ranging from around $35 to $46 per tonne. Now, historically, these free on board prices, the price of the pellets themselves, have been volatile. This is a snapshot from 2015 to 2017, and it shows you the free on board prices of the North American market and some European markets. Now, there is a big drop in price reported starting in the end of 2015, and this was due to a change in policy in the Netherlands. They actually stopped financially supporting biomass for use in their power stations, and also made some changes to the sustainability criteria as well. So even though the Netherlands was only a small player in the global market, I think they were importing around 300,000 tonnes a year before the policy change. When the policy changed, that dropped to virtually zero, and that caused a crash in the global pellet price. So it was a reduction of about 30%, 25 to 30% of the pellet price, just because a small consuming nation changed their policy towards biomass. Now, this is probably better shown in this longer term graph. I should highlight that this is the cost, insurance and freight prices, so this includes your freight rates. This goes all the way back to 2009, and here we can clearly see the effect of the change in policy in the Netherlands. But even before the change in policy, the price is still quite volatile. But again, because this is the cost, insurance and freight price, it does actually include the volatility in the freight market itself. So freight rates currently are around $20 to $30 a tonne, depending on ship size, and this is shipping from the US to the EU. Historically, these freight rates have been much higher. In 2008, they were around about $100 per tonne just before the crash. So if you consider long-term investment in co-firing plant, then this volatility in the freight rates is very important. It's estimated that for the next 5 to 10 years, freight rates will probably stay around the $30 to $35 per tonne mark, because freight rates are driven by the global economy. Biomass shipping is such a small percentage of total shipping volume that it has no real effect on the freight rate itself. So because we're still not fully recovered globally from the crash, the 2008 crash, freight rates should hopefully stay the same. Again, if it goes back up to $100 a tonne, it's a significant increase in your feedstock price. Now, I should mention, when this graph was produced, they tried to predict future prices. Currently, we're around about $165, $170 per tonne for that same shipping route. So we're at the top end of their estimation. Now, again, any future changes in demand, particularly in Asia, they'll have a huge effect on the global wood pellet price, dependent on or Asia able to provide their own pellets, and it might not necessarily have a huge impact on the global pellet market itself. So that was the first section associated with the cost, just a brief snapshot of some of the costs of the fuel. Now, if we look at the infrastructure costs, this is much more difficult to estimate because, again, it's based on co-firing ratios and it's based on the state of your existing infrastructure. But in general, the capital costs include a dedicated new biomass and reception, new dedicated biomass reception area, new covered storage and conveyor systems. So, due to the nature of biomass fuel, if it's left outside, it deteriorates. It's much more reactive than coal, so any dust that you've got lying around increases your fire and explosion risks, and we've seen in the past, actually, well, just recently at DRAX there was a fire, well, an incident. Also shown in the image is one of DRAX's 75,000-ton dome storage centres. This is at the top end of what really is required for biomass storage, just due to the large volumes that they require. Some people, some companies just use covered sheds, which, you know, is a lot cheaper than the famous DRAX domes. In addition to storage and conveyor systems, you need to upgrade your milling infrastructure. Some companies have been able to modify their vertical spindle mills to handle the larger volumes of biomass required. Some people have invested in new dedicated hammer mills. All this is dependent on the existing infrastructure. And finally, modifications to the combustion infrastructure. So there are a number of different scenarios that you can introduce biomass into the combustion infrastructure. You can co-mill with coal. You can add biomass into the primary air pipework directly after the mills. You can introduce the biomass at the coal burner itself. You can put dedicated biomass burners onto the boiler. All this is dependent on co-firing ratios. In general, the higher the co-firing ratios, the more capital cost is required. Now, as I said, it's difficult to determine these costs. The Department of Energy and Climate Change did a review of conversions that had already happened. They spoke to the companies involved to get a price estimate, a cost estimate of what is required. We've just shown these here. The co-firing, that includes co-firing ratios up to 50%, and then we also put, we've got full conversion here just for comparison. So co-firing costs, capital costs is around about $390,000 per megawatt. Conversion isn't that much more expensive actually, it's at $411,000 per megawatt. And just highlight there's some ranges associated with the total capex required, and the range for the co-firing is much larger than that for full conversion, and that is just due to there is more data available for co-firing costs than there is for full conversion. So that's just some of the costs that you can expect with your plant conversion. Again, should highlight it's co-firing ratio based. Now, if we start to look at the second major requirement for co-firing to be competitive, it's the sustainability criteria. And here we're looking at some of the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with co-firing. Now again, this is based on a North American produced pellet being shipped over to the EU and combusted in EU power stations. We can see here the pellet production data was taken from literature. There's lots and lots of studies, life cycle analysis studies on the emissions associated with pellet production. The transport scenario is actually one that we developed ourselves just to represent the main trade route. Now, these figures are based on different locations of pellet production. But if we just focus on the first one, West Canada, EU, there is two plots. The difference in these two is how the pellet's been produced. So the feedstock needs to be dry to meet the moisture content levels in the international standard. And there is a huge difference in total emissions dependent on what utility fuel you use for that drying process. So biomass is assumed carbon neutral at the point of combustion. And the only emissions associated with using biomass as a drying utility fuel is the additional emissions associated with the collection and transportation of that fuel being taken to the pellet plant. So you can see if reduction of emissions is the key priority of co-firing, then you can improve your emissions reductions simply by using biomass over natural gas. In fact, natural gas results in about a 40% increase under the same transport scenario in total greenhouse gas emissions. Now also, a huge contributor to total emissions is transport. It's responsible for around 20 to 60% of all emissions, dependent on whether it's biomass drying or whether it's natural gas drying. And again, if emissions reduction is the key target that we're trying to achieve, then if we can reduce the transportation, then we can significantly reduce the emissions associated with co-firing. Now, there's two ways to do this. You can either increase co-firing or biomass use in producer nations, such as North America, or we can try and produce more in consumer nations, such as the EU. However, it's uncertain what kind of levels are available in the EU to increase production further. But because that data was taken from literature, we wanted to compare to real-world emissions data. And luckily, DRAX have to publish their emissions in order to qualify for their renewable obligation certificates. So here we can see what DRAX report for their emissions, and also we can see the current UK target for total emissions from biomass utilisation. Now, in 2025, that target is going to reduce down even further, and there is going to be an introduction of an emissions limit in some upcoming EU legislation, the Renewable Energy Directive 2. That is expected to be at a similar level as the UK 2025 target. So here we can see that DRAX do meet current and future UK and EU emissions targets that are associated with biomass use. But under our scenario, it suggested that if we start using natural gas as a utility fuel, that perhaps it might be difficult to meet the new, more stringent targets that are expected in 2025. But the key point here is that wood pellets can meet the stricter emissions targets that are expected in the UK and in the Renewable Energy Directive 2 by the EU, even when we're shipping long distances. So even under the US to EU scenario, we can still meet these stricter emissions targets. So we took the data from the cost estimate, so we looked at the fuel prices, and then we determined the levelised cost of electricity generation for co-firing and compared this to other renewable technologies. So the levelised cost of electricity generation is dependent on capital expenditure required, operating lifetime, discount rates, maintenance costs, feedstock costs, capacity factors, thermal efficiencies. And when we plug the co-firing into the model, we end up with a nice graph that gives you some kind of idea of what to expect. And here we've got different co-firing ratios, so 10% being the cheapest, 50% is higher again. That's due to the additional capital costs required and the cost of the fuel, additional biomass fuel. And then at the end, we've got other renewable technologies, so large-scale solar PV and offshore wind. So in terms of levelised cost of electricity generation, we can see that co-firing is competitive with other renewable technologies. Now, because plant lifetime is, in this case, I think for co-firing it's 15 years, offshore wind and solar is around about 25 years, it's useful to try and include any future changes in climate change policy. Now, one way that you can do that is by introducing a carbon price. So we introduced a $30 carbon price based on existing IEA methodology, and when that is introduced, then obviously solar and offshore wind, their costs reduce relative to co-firing, so they become more attractive than they were without the implementation of a carbon price compared to co-firing. But even so, even with the introduction of a reasonably high carbon price, where we're not at anywhere near those levels yet in the EU, we can still see that co-firing is competitive. Also, the range in estimated costs for co-firing is narrower than that for the solar and offshore wind scenarios, and that's just because of their uncertainties and their capital cost requirements. Interestingly as well, when we do start to introduce a carbon price, the difference in levelised cost of electricity generation between the lower and higher co-firing ratios narrows. So that suggests that if carbon prices do start to elevate and are introduced, then it might be more cost effective to start using higher co-firing ratios. So yes, from this we are still competitive in terms of levelised cost of electricity generation. Now the next step was to say, okay, what about cost of CO2 abatement? So we took the levelised costs of electricity, including the $30 per tonne carbon price, and the emissions scenarios that we looked at earlier, and we said, okay, what are the potential emissions reductions, and how does that compare to other renewable technologies? So here we can see that as you increase the co-firing ratio, then your cost of CO2 abatement decreases, which is what you'd expect, and that we are, most importantly, still competitive with other renewable technologies. Now, I should say as well, we all know solar and wind are intermittent. Now, if deployment starts to increase of these technologies and we need to start including storage, whether it's battery storage or any other form of storage, then these costs will increase the capital costs associated with offshore wind and solar PV. So if the deployment of those if we get more deployment of those technologies and we have to include battery storage, then that would increase the competitiveness of co-firing relative to these technologies. But I should highlight, even with a $30 per tonne carbon price, that co-firing is still competitive with these technologies. And any changes in fuel price, so say if we start using a wider range of feedstock materials, so the cheaper agricultural residues, then again, this would increase the attractiveness of co-firing. If we can reduce shipping rates, so if we can reduce shipping distances, we not only decrease the emissions associated with those, but we also reduce the costs. So this again would make biomass even more attractive. So if we think about in Asia, where they are expected to meet their own demand in terms of biomass production, then co-firing could be much more competitive in those areas. So there's a few uncertainties regarding the future of co-firing, and it's mainly driven by market and policy factors. The main market driver is going to be the increase in demand, particularly from Asia, and how this is going to affect the overall price of the fuel. We could see increased competition from other types of biomass. So again, in Japan, I think they are using an agricultural residue in fluidized beds combustion. So I think it's a palm kernel shell actually, which again is an internationally traded commodity, but not at the level seen for wood pellets. Policy, we've already seen that policy can affect prices through the crash in Netherlands, but the main policy issue that is coming up, actually, that could have a huge implication for the whole wood pellet market is the potential inclusion in the EU Renewable Energy Directive 2 new sustainability criteria clause that requires any pellet producing country are signed up to the Paris Agreement. Now, as we all know, America have withdrawn, and America are the largest provider of the clean wood pellets used in EU electricity production at the minute. They supply around about 4 million tonnes a year, which percentage-wise I think it's quite high. So if this clause was introduced and America couldn't provide us with our meet our pellet demand, then we couldn't meet current pellet demand in the EU, never mind any future growth that we might see. So this is really the key point that we expect to have the largest effect on EU wood pellet use. So the main point from this is co-firing is competitive with wind and solar, even with a huge wood pellet with a huge carbon price. Competitiveness can be improved by reducing shipping distances. That could have a huge effect on both the cost and the emissions associated with wood pellet utilisation. Well, thank you for listening. I should mention that the report is currently at the draft stage and it will be published in March. If anybody would like a copy for peer review, then they should contact Debo Adams. Her email address is here on the last slide. The next webinar from the IEA takes place on Wednesday, the 21st of February at midday, and it's on the NOx control for high ash coals. Now, if anybody has any questions, please send them through and I'll try to answer them. Okay, we have one question that's just come through, and it says, how has the wood pellet production in America affected other wood markets? As we said, pellet production in America is quite high, but actually what they're doing is there's been a decline in the paper and pulp industry in America since 2008. So the increased use of wood pellets is it's just replacing a decline in other markets. I think there's been a decline in the wood processing industries as well. So actually, even though we are continually ramping up production of wood pellets in the US, we're not using the same amount of feedstock material as we've seen before the 2008 crash. So in terms of maintenance of existing forest, well, what I'm trying to say is the feedstock used is still at a lower level than before the economic crash. Future demand, I mean, if Asia do come to the international market, then yes, we could see a change in that scenario. America could start producing and using a lot more feedstock material than it did before 2008. But again, this is uncertain. Do we have any more questions? If anybody does have any more questions, then feel free to contact me on my email address, bandooley@outlook.com, or you can email Debo Adams at the IEA, and we can get back to you if you've got any more in-depth questions that you'd like answered. Thanks for listening. could buy